Hi everyone, my name is Clement. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Hugging Face. At Hugging Face, we are arguably the most used NLP platform out there, with more than 5,000 companies using us, including Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, Grammarly that you can see here. We're basically a platform for companies to build better NLP. And today I wanted to talk about a topic that I think we need to talk more about, which is NLP or AI ethics. Why do I say that we need to talk more about it? Is because usually a good framework to tell how much do we need to talk about moral or value-driven frameworks when it comes to technology is to look at two things. First, how much harm the technology can do to people, and second, how many people the technology impacts. And for NLP, we're very much at the turning point for both of these, and I'm going to explain why. First, when it comes to how much harm it can do to people, I wanted to remind something to everyone, which is that transformer models, which are like the dominant kind of models that we're using for NLP now, are highly biased, right? Here I took the example of BERT, arguably the most popular NLP models of all time. And you can see that if you do word prediction for BERT by asking it, this man works as, you're going to get the prediction like lawyer, carpenter, doctor, waiter, mechanic. Whereas if you give it the prompt, this woman works as, you're going to get nurse, waitress, teacher, maid, prostitute. So what you see here is that this model is highly gender biased, right? And when you think that these models can be used for resume filtering in HR, cover letter filtering, you see that the risk of it harming and discriminating against women is pretty high. Then the second thing that we need to look at to see the importance of thinking about ethics is how many people it impacts. And I wanted to share just 4 examples of highly used NLP models in production. The first one is search. Google is arguably the biggest consumer tech product of all time. Over 1 billion people are using it every day. And they said, same as Bing and other search engines, that they're really heavily use NLP models today, obviously to rank the search results, but also to build new features like question answering that I'm showing here, which is when you're asking a question, it's going to find the answer in the first page of results and display this answer as a first result directly on the result page. Another massively used NLP feature is autocomplete, right? If you think of Gmail, if you think of LinkedIn, if you think of Microsoft Word, Google Docs now, they're all doing autocomplete powered by NLP models. Social networks are also massively using NLP models today, from translation that you can see here, but also for moderation, right? Detection of violent terms and words, for example, on a bunch of different use cases. And finally, even more technical platforms are starting to use NLP models. You might have seen that GitHub introduced a few weeks ago the ability to do autocomplete powered by NLP. All of these use cases that billions of people are using today are powered by NLP model, by transformers. So the scale of the usage makes it even more important today to think about AI ethics and NLP ethics. This is one of the reasons why at Hugging Face, we're super happy to welcome to our team Margaret Mitchell, who's one of the most renowned researcher on the topic of AI ethics. She was co-leading the ethical AI group at Google. And a lot of the rest of the talk I'm going to give you today is very much directly inspired by Margaret's work. I'm using some of her slides as we at Hugging Face are using her research in our processes to build our machine learning platform. And to kind of like start to be action and impact driven, you have to try to understand what is AI ethics. What is ethics in AI? And first, ethics does not provide the final answer. Margaret is explaining that provides a way to analyze problems in light of human values, right? And some of these values can be honor, kindness, equity, inclusion, commitment, cooperation, connect, honesty, and more, right? So then when you think about these values, you have to think about the machine learning process. So let me start with that. So usually the way you build machine learning today is kind of like contains kind of like four steps, right? You start with some sort of a data set, training data that you collect and that you annotate. Then you use a model that you train, that you fine-tune, that you pre-train. Then you are doing some sort of post-processing, or you integrate it with your current software stack to finally deliver the output or the prediction to final users, right? Now let's try to understand what are like the potential biases and challenges that each of these steps are posing. So first, when you think about training data, you realize that even before the data itself, there has been some human and social biases that have been injected into it, right? Especially in NLP, we all know that language is a social construct. So you're gonna see a lot of the human biases that are contained in any NLP data set, right? If you think about the large models like BERT, like GPT, like T5, like Roberta, they're all trained on some sort of a slice of the web that contains a lot of biases, right? Reporting bias, selection bias, stereotyping, racism, underrepresentation. Then when you take these first data, these first kind of like biases in the data set, and you go into kind of like the model training, you add some more human biases, right? And these are kind of like the results of who's building the model and sometimes kind of like having default effect by picking kind of like the default model like BERT without thinking too much about it. But also you see anchoring bias, or you see problems like overfitting, underfitting. Then when you get into the post-processing, again, you get a lot of additional human bias, like confirmation bias, congruence bias. Sometimes when you're trying to post-process an NLP model, you actually create even more human bias. A good example of that is I remember a team who was trying to reduce the capabilities for text generation models to talk about sexual topics, right? Because it was a problem. And so what they did is that in post-processing, they tried to filter that. But obviously, it creates more biases. For example, not representing enough anymore categories like LGBTQ categories, where, for example, when you have mentions of transsexuality, obviously this is a mention of sexuality. And so if you remove it in the post-processing, you actually create more biases than you remove. And then finally, after these three types of biases, what's interesting is that it gets into the usage, the user side, which we are starting to see can amplify these challenges because as the users are interacting with NLP models, they're sometimes actually creating some sort of like a network effect or some sort of a transmission of the bias to the very first step of this process. Good example of that is autocomplete, right? If your autocomplete is biased and you have people writing more and more content with autocomplete, it's pretty likely that the next generation of models is going to use this text and be even more biased than the previous models. That's what Margaret is calling bias laundering. And the challenge here is that it's really hard at the end of the process to understand where bias has been created in these steps. And also it creates this kind of like a vicious cycle where the more bias you get coming in, the more bias you have at the end of the process. What's really exciting, though, is that it can also work both ways, right? In the sense that if we manage to mitigate the bias, we will never be able to completely reduce, to completely eliminate bias. But if we manage to mitigate it, potentially you'll create kind of like a network effect and a virtuous cycle where, for example, with autocomplete, you'll create less biased text that hopefully can be used later on for training and improve the overall bias of machine learning. So when you think about that, you realize that the full machine learning development pipeline is not value neutral, right? There are a lot of challenges. There are a lot of biases that it's very, very important to tackle. Now let's maybe take each one of these steps and try to see what we can do to make it more value informed, right? For example, what we can do at the training data, we can work on copyright of data instances. We can work on consent of data providers. We can work on fair pay for annotators. We can work on diversity in what the data represents. When we move on to more like the model, we can work on things like appropriateness of loss function, appropriateness of model. How do you pick a model? Why do you pick a model? Or appropriateness of the evaluation. Like, how do you assess a model? How do you assess the different biases and different limitations of models? When you go into the post-processing, you can work on things like fairness of outcome, diversity of choices. You can think about inclusion of the user or stereotype removal. And finally, when you think about the usage of these models and this technology, you can think about minimizing social harm by kind of like picking the use cases that are going to have a positive impact on the world. And you can also think about boosting these positive use cases by working on them or training on them to be able to have a positive impact on the world. And I wanted to kind of like not stay a little bit abstract, but give you 2 examples of how taking value-informed approach allowed us at Hugging Face to make progress on the topic. So the first one I wanted to share is on this second step, when the model is picked and the model is trained. What we realized, because people have shared over 20,000 models on the Hugging Face platform, is that it can be really difficult for people and companies to pick a model for the lack of information, right? Usually it's going to be a team from Google, Facebook, Microsoft, training a model like Bert, Roberta, T5 that you can see here. And then it's going to be another team that is going to use these models. So in order to kind of make it easier for companies to use value-driven processes, we used the research of Margaret Mitchell and others from Google to implement something called model cards, right, for model reporting. And what are model cards? They are transparent documentation for benefits, harms, risks, or users uses, intentional or not, metrics, why metrics were chosen, evaluation tests and results. And what they do is that they provide enough transparency for companies to be able to take value-informed decisions when they pick a model, and hopefully to reduce the potential for harm by picking a different use case. So for example, if you think about HR, what we talked about with Bert at the beginning, instead of picking a model like Bert to filter cover letter, maybe they are going to use it in a different way or add it with a human in the loop in order to avoid the biases. And it's been really powerful because we've had now over 5,000 models that have been where model cards have been added for additional information and additional transparency. Another example of that is on the training data and how it can sometimes be not diverse enough, especially on something around languages, right? Because what we see on the typical data sets is that English is overrepresented, which leads to an overrepresentation of English-speaking people in the data set. So to kind of mitigate that, what we did at Hugging Face is we organized a community sprint that over 500 researchers all over the world participated in, to be able to bring some speech-to-text models to over 50 low-resource languages, right, which are languages that are not as studied and which don't have as much data than English. And what we think is that it helped reducing the misrepresentation of languages. So these are just two examples of what we've started to do, what the community can do to reduce biases, start focusing on more fairness for machine learning. And I believe this is just the beginning. There's much more potential to include value-informed processes into NLP and to improve the outcome of these models to be a positive force in the world. If you think about a lot of our society's problems, from climate change, from vaccines, toxicity of public platforms, machine learning can and should help more. For example, on social networks, you can't have a human to check for racist, violent comments, fake news. We need machine learning and NLP value informed to be able to help more. And that's the only way, I think, for me, for NLP, not only to be a very impactful technology, but to be a useful and helpful and positive technology for the world. So if you're interested to keep the conversation going, feel free to check Hugging Face. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or LinkedIn. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the event.